Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to see you here today. My name is Dr. Julia Henderson. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy here at University of British Columbia. And I had the distinct pleasure of being the postdoctoral fellow of our guest speaker today, Kim Sawchuk. And I'll introduce her in just a moment. Um, I'd like to first just take a moment to acknowledge that I'm here today coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and stolen territories of the Musqueam people, um, which is on the UBC Vancouver campus. And the you know, surrounding areas are the lands and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I'd like to express my gratitude to the traditional caretakers of these lands. My research is in the field of aging and older age. And as I think about aging, I like to think about how we are not only aging as humans, but we're aging in relationship with all of that which with us is around us, the lands, the greater than human world, even in what we're talking about today in terms of the technologies that are aging around us. And so I am really grateful to the Indigenous knowledge carriers and elders that I've worked with that have helped me have a better understanding of that and of Indigenous place thought and how it helps me understand the aging of everything in relationship around me. And I am delighted that, again, this is our second talk in this wonderful series that's now a partnership between Providence Health and the UBC Edwin S.H. Leung Center for Healthy Aging. And it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker in this sort of mini series on aging and technology. Today, I would like to introduce Dr. Kim Sawchuk. Kim is director of Engage, Center for Research on Aging in Montreal, and director of the Aging Communication and Technology Lab at Concordia University. She is principal investigator on the 7-year Aging in Data project, a research project that explores how an era of unprecedented digital data gathering impacts and governs how we grow old in our communities. Kim holds a Concordia University Research Chair in Mobile Media Studies, which focuses on how older adults engage with digital technologies in their everyday lives. This work intersects with critical disability studies. Kim was the editor of the Canadian Journal of Communication and has written numerous articles, book chapters, and policy reports on aging with technology. Her research often involves participatory action methods and finding creative collaborative solutions to shared social issues in the name of social justice. So welcome, Kim.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you to the organizers. I'd like to acknowledge that I am on the unceded and stolen territories of the Ganahagi Nation on the island of Tiohtià:ke, otherwise known as Montreal. And this nation, the Ganahagi, have been the custodians of these lands and these waters that surround me for millennium. And I'm grateful for their stewardship and for the ongoing lessons that they teach us about how to be better persons in this world and how to learn to practice different forms of decolonization, which are ongoing. So I'm going to talk to you today about a project that I've been working on in a series of thought experiments, I guess, that I call digital care work. It comes from my own obsession, I suppose, and years of practice as someone who's both a researcher, but also someone who lives in the world and has done a lot of different types of care work. I worked in the daycare industry as a daycare worker for several years to put myself through university. During COVID, I became a informal caregiver to my father, who was dying at the time. And like many other people living in our society, we practice care work. Care work is all around us. So I'm a media and communication studies scholar, as Julia mentioned, And one of the things I like to do is to really think about how concepts, ideas, and practices that come from other realms, other occupations, other ways of thinking can really unsettle and inform how I go about my research as a communication studies scholar, but how it can possibly intersect as well with what's happening in other fields. Like to think of this as a kind of a form of generative knowledge making together. And so I begin. Oh, if I can actually do this. There we go. Just have to change some things around on my screen so I can actually talk to the slides I'm doing. First, I want to open up the question of what is care. And here my own thinking has been highly influenced by the work of political scientist Joan Toronto. There's a small book called Who Cares, but has a much larger book that's on what she calls moral boundaries. I'm going to return to this definition, I think, at the end of this talk so that we can discuss it. To me, it's incredibly important because it speaks as well to what Julia was talking about when she was saying we have to acknowledge the ways that the world around us is alive, perhaps has agency, and is active in how we have to live our lives. This is a definition, I think, of care that points to also relationality and co-responsibility. So Toronto says that care is a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we might live as well as possible. I want to add, live together as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, our environment, all of which seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. So in her definition of care, and I'm not going to go too deep into theory today, Toronto talks about 3 or 4 types of relations that she wants us to think about. Caring about, which is the complicated task of defining what matters, what needs exist. Caring for, which entails accepting responsibility and realizing that something needs to be done and that you want to do something about it. The act of caregiving, or acknowledging that doing care is not about something that you can do on the couch. It requires quite often a lot of work. It can be a labor of love, as Meg Luxton once wrote, but it does require work. And then there's care receiving, which also requires looking at the situation and the resources assigned to improve it and asking if it has met the identified needs. But I also think this care receiving is important in a way that Toronto could explore further, which is about, I think, the reciprocity that happens in the exchange between humans or humans and others in the moment of caregiving. I want to situate myself, again, I'm on the island of Jojoge, Montreal, and to say, why do I care about this? What matters to me? So I just want to open up with some perhaps very boring statistics and data, but that I hope helps to contextualize why I care about what I'm calling digital care work. So in 2019, adults age 65 and older in Quebec represented about almost 19.2% of the population, making it one of the Canadian provinces with the highest proportion of older adults in its population. That 93% of Canadian older adults also live in private dwellings that are houses, apartments, or movable dwellings rather than residential facilities such as long-term care and hospitals. We've also had a crisis of long-term care in Quebec during COVID that was present before, and that's ongoing and that people are trying to tackle here, but that's another topic. I want to also mention that 35% of older people live alone in Montreal, and 28% have reported difficulty in buying goods or accessing services. So prior to the pandemic, only 50% of people over the age of 75 access the internet regularly. There's a group called Sawchuk who collects this kind of data. But I also want to mention another piece of data and that I forgot to put in my slide, but I'll just read. So according to another Observatoire Québécoise on inequality from 2020, that we know that there's also a significant gap in ICT or internet communication technology use that's related to income levels. So while 74% of seniors age 65 and over are internet users, this figure drops to 43% for seniors earning less than $20,000 a year. We also know that this is often also related to issues of gender, and gender is also related to issues of race. So again, in our research in our lab and in what we do, we try to take this intersectional approach to understanding the full implications of what we mean when we think about access to digital technologies. And when I say technologies, that's primarily what I'm talking about and what I mean. I'm thinking about digital media access. I'm thinking about the internet, and I'm thinking about all the tools and hardware and all the infrastructures that one needs to assemble around oneself in order to get the information that one wants or to make connections to the people or services that one needs. Also, other research has indicated that 40% of people, of older people, have reported a decline in their mental health during the pandemic, and over 57% have reported loneliness, low mood, worry, and isolation in the wake of COVID, which, as many of us know, is not exactly over. So in our lab, and I'll just speak a little bit about this, the ACT Lab has been around since about 2013. I've been researching issues of older adults in relationship to digital technologies. Well, I wrote my first paper in 1996. I guess I'll tell you how old I am. I was 36 at the time. And I was thinking at that time about how our society creates age segmentations based on marketing research data that divides people into specific kinds of demographics and the kinds of images of aging that resulted as a result. But since then, since 2009, I've been looking at mobile media and social media, and thinking about the transition in particular of our society from something like the landline phone, still incredibly important to many older adults, to a society where it's assumed you have access to cell service and smartphones. I began my first project in 2009 with Dr. Barbara Crow, that we called Seniors and Cells. We thought we were going to talk to maybe 20 older adults about their use of technology. And what happened is that we ended up doing over 300 interviews and surveys with older adults across the country, many of whom said to us at the time, "What, you want to talk to us about our use of digital, of our use to access to the internet, or our use of telephones and cell phones? Most people only want to talk to us about our health." And so we had to convince them at the time that we didn't work for Bell and that we were in fact university researchers genuinely interested in their experiences and uses and practices of these devices. I work a lot with a group called RECA, Respecting Elders Communities Against Abuse, on issues of older adult mistreatment. And we've worked with them on several projects I'll mention in a minute. We work very closely with another organization called New Hope for Senior Citizens, who do a lot of Meals on Wheels and community-based work and lunches. We work with a group in Montreal called Groupe Harmonie, who also work in what are in Quebec known as HLMs, or social housing, bringing digital devices and technologies and know-how and creative experiences in using digital devices to do projects with them of their own device choosing and making. And this is a project, what you see on the screen is Stan from a project we did in 2014 called A Year in My Life, called Stan's Story, which is just a wonderful recounting from Stan about a moment in his life. A year in his life was what we asked people to talk about. And in this, I realized there's a relationship to the topic of care, because Stan was a bit of a loner, and through the digital media project we set up in the HLM where he lived, he came out, he'd been in mourning and grieving for his wife who had died several years ago. And he both told the story and sang a song that he always sung for her. But he talked about how, as he had aged and how he had worked in the bartending industry, when she got sick, that their roles had reversed and he became the formal caregiver, and how important that was as a transformative experience for him. So I always think when I give this paper about Stan as well. We worked with Les Petits Frères et Sœurs, or Big Brother, Big Sisters, an organization called Reclaim that deals with literacy issues in Montreal that are not specifically age-related, but a vast majority of their clientele actually are older adults because there have been issues of access to education and literacy in Quebec for a number of years. And finally, we've also worked with Chinese Family and Social Services on various projects. I say this because these community organizations, to me, form a vast tissue in the city of Montreal that do a kind of care work that is actually kind of unacknowledged, particularly during the pandemic, in relationship to helping their constituents get online and maintain connection. So I think within the care world realm, quite often we'll talk about informal caregivers and formal caregivers. And one of the questions we've had as researchers was, how is it that this other sector provides certain forms of care that are often unacknowledged, and when they're, I think, undervalued, and they are certainly underpaid, and it's quite often very unstable, precarious work, but really important work. So part of our objective at the lab is to create connections to these organizations, to think about how we can also help them sustain their mandates for caring for the communities to which they have an affinity and a connection. In terms of digital care work, I just want to mention and put a little meat on the bones tonight, or this afternoon. I say tonight because it's actually getting on to past 4 here in Montreal. So, and the sun is setting and it's getting darker and darker here. So as mentioned, I've been looking at the transition to wireless society since 2009. We've been involved at the ACT Lab co-creating digital storytelling experiences, particularly targeting members of our society who have not had traditionally access to digital technologies for various reasons. We've been keeping track of stories of abusive and misleading practices. And in fact, this happened because through doing the kind of complementary work with other organizations in these other realms, what we would get when we would help older adults learn to get online or teach them certain applications or help them understand, why it was what they needed to do to get their computers running again, or how to upgrade an operating system, is we started to hear stories of people would start to bring us their bills and show to us the fact that they were paying for services that they had no idea how to use. So this ended up leading to a whole investigation that we presented to the CRTC on what we call abusive and misleading telecommunication practices. And we solicited and worked with many of our older adults, having them go through government websites, but also helping us to write the brief. And from their perspective, also helping us to bring a language on older adult mistreatment and elder abuse that we thought was a systemic issue that was not being addressed in terms of the ways that older adults were being targeted, and golden lists were being devised. Because again, these are very complicated situations. Younger people who tend to be younger who work in those environments are also under the injunction quite often to have to upsell in order to maintain a quota. So again, these kinds of situations happen not because people are malintentioned, but because there's systemic factors at play. We've worked with organizations on helping them develop websites, blogs, and creating projects. As you know, for many of you who've worked with community organizations or non-for-profits would know, in the let's just say it, with the Harper government, whenever that year was, now I've blotted it out of my mind, what happened was that a lot of the core funding for community organizations was cut. So what a lot of this sector has to do is they have to find projects that they have to do over and over. They can't do them over again. They can't sustain them. They have to keep innovating and developing new projects for programs like New Horizons for Seniors, and find other ways to supplement their core funding. And what's been interesting is finding ways to work with these organizations to help them get a techno twist, I guess, that's meaningful to them and to their communities, and that also won't suck their resources out, because a lot of what we have witnessed over the years is that if you put digital technology into an application, quite often projects will end up getting funded. It's sad, but it quite often has been true. During the pandemic, we also have worked with people who don't have access to digital devices. What we knew in Montreal was that a lot of grocery stores assumed, well, Meals on Wheels programs that were offered by organizations like New Hope were, of course, canceled because they ended up, a lot of their volunteers were older and couldn't leave their houses, couldn't leave their homes. But as well, their kitchen was so small they couldn't deal with the social distancing measures. So what that meant was that 700 people who would have gotten Meals on Wheels suddenly were not having access to food. Their group grocery, where they would take older adults to buy and shop for groceries on a weekly basis together, had to be canceled, and people were left on their own. The assumption was that older adults in Montreal would buy online, but as I've already told you, that is a false assumption. Even if you did know how to buy online, navigating the grocery websites was often quite complicated. And there were also very, very long waiting lists that you had to schedule deliveries and such. And it was incredibly difficult to access, even if you knew it were digitally adept, access groceries online during this time. So with New Hope, we set up a way to enlist students. Excuse me, I have a cold. I'm getting over one. Enlist students who would have been working with us on researchers to help us set up an action research projects to reach older adults in particular who did not have digital access so that they wouldn't go hungry. So again, a lot of our work is not only, we're not digital pushers, we're trying to understand the complexity of why people use, have access, or oftentimes don't have access, and what that can mean for them on a daily basis. We also found ourselves facilitating organizations in their transition to Zoom so their activities could continue to during COVID. We found ourselves assisting organizations that were furnishing tablets to older adults and helping them develop evaluation criteria in order to be able to evaluate whether or not those tools were effective. And of course, what we found was that it wasn't enough to be able to give an older adult a tablet. That what people found is that if you couldn't afford the digital data, that the tablet wasn't going to let you do what you needed to do. Finally, we've been also in the past developing digital tools and evaluative measures for people in the medical field who are interested in telehealth and telemedicine. Again, what that even means, as we've been finding during scoping reviews, is a vast range of activities that can actually mean anything from I'm using the telephone to I'm using Zoom, to I'm doing online consultations, to I dream of a day when this will all be virtual and you'll have your headset at home and I'll be able to communicate with you in this way. We also worked with the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts at this point on a virtual museum program to try and help counter social isolation, but also to think whether or not cultural organizations could use digital technologies and tools to do outreach to older adults. I am not going to go through the results of all these programs, but when I think about my own interest in digital care work, each and every one of these ongoing projects both has helped to establish relationships to communities, but has also nourished my understanding of the complexities of what I'm calling digital care work and why it is I care about care in a digital age. Not just formal care work, but what does it mean now to be growing older in a society that assumes that digital access is everywhere, that telehealth is on the horizon, and that everybody actually has access to these tools and technologies. So I care about this. One of the models that we found very useful for thinking about what are the accesses to sort of understanding what it means to age in a digital society, and I think is important for thinking about where I locate where care work will and happen in a digital world. This I borrow from Andrew Clement and Leslie Shade from a 2000 article called, where they introduced to us the Access Rainbow model, where they have these kind of nice, neat layers from carriage facilities to devices, to the software, to content and services, to access provision, to literacy levels, to issues of regulation and governance, to describe where it is that things can go wrong. Why I find this model important, as much as it also is something I'm going to trouble in a minute, is that when we've done a lot of literacy programs with older adults, one of the things that we noticed is that older adults will engage in what I call, and also sometimes um, facilitators, if they haven't been talked to, what I call age, blame, and shame, where people will say, it's because I'm older that I can't do this. Or there's a kind of sense of, I was born into this generation of media and I know this. And that is true. There's a level of familiarity that we all have because we were born into different kind of what they would call generations of media use. But that's not a full story. And what we've found is that at any moment that we're engaged in a project that's digital literacy related, or where we're trying to do something creative, or we're trying to understand what's happening, why someone can't, an individual or an organization is having difficulties, is that we have to get them to think that it isn't just because the software is difficult to manage. It's not only a psychological barrier like techno stress or as my colleague Leet Nimrod writes about, that they've internalized. It's also because there's things built into the devices and the systems that mean you have to constantly be on top of these changes. And again, people will say to me, well, Kim, you realize that in the next generation, all these older people who don't know how to use these devices are going to be gone. And I say to them, listen, X, you realize that there's always going to be a new device, but B, that anything that you actually have demands of you constant maintenance. To go back to Toronto, maintenance, care, and upkeep. We all have been there. You change one thing, you upgrade one piece of software, you fear doing it, you do it, and suddenly your printer doesn't work anymore because it's non-compatible. So these are not just things that are problems of the individual. These are things that are built into the affordances of the device, but also into the model we have around digital consumerism that's predicated again on obsolescence, but is also again about related to issues around, do you have someone around you who can help you troubleshoot, is related to, have I acquired enough expertise through being able to experience making mistakes over time, etc. Going backwards. So rather than the Axis rainbow, really when Constance Lafontaine, my partner, and I think of what it means to work in the digital world, it's less like that neat rainbow of troubleshooting that one has to engage in. It's more like this entangled bowl of spaghetti, which I think of the Axis rainbow bowl of spaghetti, that one problem is bound up with the other, and it's really difficult to separate one from the other. They don't exist in a neat kind of orderly fashion. I also think this looks like a kind of drawer I have in my house of old cables. I'm sure some of you do. Should I hang on to that particular USB cable, even though I don't even know where the device is anymore? So we start to accumulate these things and they kind of look like that, but less colorful. This is a image from Edward Bertinsky. Again, a reminder that living in a digital world is also related to that kind of obsolescence and environmental issue. These are wires in a wire dump in China, and people go to these kind of places and try and separate the valuable metals from the plastics in completely toxic circumstances because they have no other form of livelihood. And I think it's worth thinking about how this obsolescence, which is also related, interestingly, to issues of age, is predicated on the idea of newness rather than caring for and hanging on to things and being able to repair them with ease. And what that might also say about the relationship of technology to issues of sustainability and in the environment and our planet well-being. I often think that a better way to think about technology is not as something that's inert, but it's really like a kind of garden. Now I'm moving from the toxic waste to the garden image of technology. But what I mean by that is it demands constant care and upkeep, pruning, sorting, maintenance, upgrading, and upgrading of your own skills. And in this sense, from a science and technology perspective, from a media studies perspective, which is where I come from, technologies are not neutral, but they have built into them what we call affordances or properties that we interact with. I learned this when I had shingles, and suddenly every touch of my fingertips to my keyboard was pain. Affordances are about how devices are built and structured so that we can use them and use them with ease. That they demand attention, and they also play a role in structuring social behaviors and our interactions with each other. For instance, I can't see anybody's face right now. All I'm doing, I feel like, is talking to myself. It feels really odd. And these kind of things can empower some and disempower others. So, what I want to turn to now is, again, to get to this question of digital care work, is to the research of a woman named Maya Bakovic, who's wrote a book in 2005 called The Internet Society. And Maya offered this term warm experts. Warm experts are intermediaries, and intermediaries are the people that possess the knowledge and the skills that are gained quite often in the systems world of technology and can operate in this world. But at the same time, um, this knowledge is not immediately always accessible in the user's life world, and you try to offer it to your fellow man and woman. So warm experts are people who have knowledge, who learn to share this knowledge well. And Becker Virginia's notion of the warm expert has been incredibly influential in my field in communication studies. And I think it's worth thinking about in relationship to what I'm calling digital care work, because I realize that a lot of what our lab has been doing and that I do in relationship to others who perhaps have less digital skills or that we rely on with each other is operating in the realm of warm expert. So warm experts help others, but at the same time, you've probably played this in your own either familiar or kinship relations or relationship to friends. When you asked, what's bandwidth? How do I upgrade? Should I do this? Is this app safe to load up? Do I need to give my credit card? Should I? Must I consent? Must I consent to what? What's incompatible with what? Where's my password? Where's the on button? You start to realize the kind of sheer amount of knowledge and know-how that one is expected to acquire to live in a digital world. But that the role of the warm expert is to offer a space where someone can ask these kinds of questions in an informal way. Quite often it's a family member, and it's been identified as such in the literatures that have followed Bakovic work. It's most often warm experts are not necessarily confined to the family in her work, but most often it's a family member who plays that role. So during COVID, what we saw was, especially in a context like Montreal, a lot of, especially if you live in an Anglophone community, either people have left or family members may not live together or have been able to see each other. And suddenly this kind of community of informal caregiving and expertise around digital helping kind of evaporated, or people had to do it online. There was a sudden realization in the context of Montreal that many people didn't have access to each other, that people were socially isolated in either long-term care facilities or in long-term residences or living in their own homes. And so there was a lot of movement in 2020 and 2021 to get older adults quickly online. And our organization, ACT, or our research lab, became involved in a project with Help Age Canada called Connecting Canadians, in which they started to employ people to be tech mentors. And so, again, to understand digital care work, I'm going to turn a little bit away from these broad and general issues of what's media technology, what's care, what do I mean by digital care work, why is it important, why does it matter, and how do we need to think about technology not just as a device, but as this kind of interconnected assemblage that acquires a whole range of skills and competencies that are demanded of us and that we constantly have to maintain and upkeep. So we interviewed at this point in 2021, and again, I'm going to refer to this particular study that we did on tech mentors, warm experts, and digital care work, pandemic lessons from a remote digital literacy training program for older adults. As I mentioned, we've been involved in a lot of digital literacy programs, mostly using creative means. That all changed during COVID. So we interviewed, I think, around 30 people who had been hired from the restaurant industry, mostly, who were unemployed and who were trained to give technology training lessons to older adults who had been given iPads mostly, who were living across the country, either in long-term care, mostly in long-term care facilities. In most of those situations, the care workers, some of them had time to be able to help older adults get online, but quite often they didn't because they were preoccupied with the whole issue of just basically taking care of what they already were commissioned and paid to take care of, that they had skills and expertise with, which was everything from ensuring that people had the kind of their needs taken care of with on a physical, emotional, and psychological level. And quite often at that point, the digital was not considered to be important. It became quite clear that it was important, but a lot of the long-term care facilities, especially the public ones that we encountered in Quebec and that we ended up working with, did not even have Wi-Fi installed in them. So again, not only did we have to find ways to provide tablets to people, but we also had to find ways to make sure that they had a connection, because that was important. So when we did our interviews with both older adults and with the tech mentors and with their employees, and we looked at the feedback that had been given to the program, I just want to talk to you about what it is that those who participated in the program identified as the digital care skills that were most important. Their values of patience, empathy, and understanding. As one tech mentor recounted, you need patience, you need empathy, you need understanding, someone who just understands who these people are, how they're feeling with the technology, and what you can do to improve that. How you can give them a sense of empowerment is so important. And the word empowerment was actually used as I went back and looked at those transcripts quite regularly and frequently. So the tech mentors, who were former restaurant workers who had minimal digital skills, but who had been enlisted in this environment of not being able to see people, but trying to mentor them over the phone on how to use digital devices, talked about these as the core skills that constituted for them the most important set of skills in terms of digital care work. The second set of attributes, what they called skills and identified as skills, we categorized when we did a thematic analysis of the transcripts, was flexibility. And what they meant by this was three things. First, recognizing the diversity of their clients. And again, when I looked at the data, who were the people who enlisted in this program? They were people anywhere from 60 to people in their 90s. The vast majority of them were people who had minimal, they did not own necessarily a cell phone. They perhaps had used a computer at some point in their life. So they had some experience, but they had often given up, because often they decided that it just wasn't important to them anymore, or because that they couldn't afford to upgrade, or because they also realized that not only did they need to have the device, but they needed to also have access to an internet connection. And again, the average Canadian household, and this is data from 2 or 3 years ago, spends on average $283 a month just to maintain communication. So if you're living on a low income, this is a significant chunk of change. If the average, I believe, older adult, and this is from data from the last Stats Canada survey, was approximately $180 a month. So again, I would recommend that after this seminar, you start to think about what it is you're paying for in order to maintain digital connection. What every $1.49 app may cost, what it might cost to have your internet and cell phone access, How do you assess what those needs are? Do you pay for streaming services? Do you have specialty channels? I like to watch hockey, confession. So I pay for Rogers Sportnet separately. But if I want to watch a football game, that's separate. If I want to watch movies, that's separate. Everything kind of starts to add up in ways that we kind of lose track of and then wonder, why is it that I feel impoverished at the end of the month? It's the cost not only of the buying the device, but like a loss leader, being able to pay for the services that you actually want. So again, flexibility was recognizing the diversity of their clients in terms of their age, but also in terms of language and cultural background. Flexibility also meant, in terms of scheduling, the older adults that would have an appointment to get assistance often found their days interrupted. So we're going to talk a little bit about the ritual dimension of what the tech mentoring programs and what digital literacy programs provide as being important beyond the technology, was that people also needed to recognize that older adults often have to stop an activity because of an appointment that's suddenly come up, or that there's the possibility that they've been on a waiting list for something and they have an opportunity to get something taken care of. So they need that kind of flexibility in relationship to time and scheduling. But tech flexibility was also discussed in terms of the goals of sociability, including the importance of the tech mentors being able to make participants feel relaxed and not rushed. So this kind of patience, calmness was seen as an absolutely valuable attribute by both the employers, by the older adults, and was also recognized as a skill that was possessed by the tech mentors. When we asked them, what do you think your most valuable skill is? They said, patience was number one, but also being flexible and also being reliable. If you say you're going to do something, show up. So these programs, and we found this in all those other things that I've talked to you about way at the beginning of this talk, that offering the kinds of digital so-called skills programs or creative opportunity to learn digital photography or participate in learning how to do a podcast were ways for people to acquire digital skills, to overcome fears they might have had that they would break the technology, to understand that when they come to a project, nobody knows everything, and it's through sharing around a table that we all learn. But there was also a sense that reliability, that there was a ritual dimension to the activities, that the mentor would be there on a weekly basis. And during COVID, this was particularly important, but I would say this has also been important for other projects we've been involved with, is that people knowing that they can drop in on a Tuesday. We don't always know who's going to show up, but that we're there to be kind of a reliable, warm expert to whom they can develop a relationship of trust, and they can ask what they might see as dumb questions that may make them feel like this is perhaps related to how old I am. I'm not with it. I'm not part of this world. Part of our job is to say, yes, you are. And nobody knows everything. None of us do. And we all learn from each other. So as one older adult said, these sessions became my social hour. I get to socialize and I feel like I'm a human being now. So in a sense, when we talk about technology and digital devices and learning digital skills, we also think about them as a vehicle actually for any form of communication. By communication, I also want to point out that from a communication studies perspective, we think about communication in two ways. First, in terms of an efficiency model, where we want to get a message across, called the transmission model of communication, but that communication is also a ritual practice in which that's an event and that creates symbolic and relational meanings between human beings that occurs over and in time. So again, taking the time to be present to others, to listen to what it is they're not understanding from the perspective of the tech mentors who were, in a sense, paid warm members, was incredibly important. So I want to just and go back to this idea of digital care work and understanding the valuing of what skills. It's not necessarily the tech expertise, I want to say, that we learned from this study and have learned from over 11 years of doing digital workshops now with older adults in our communities, that digital care work is about developing strategies to empower older adults and not simply to force them to become digital, what we call forced mediatization. This means valuing the expertise that they bring to any event that we create together. It means at a social and political level of understanding and acknowledging the skills that are involved with those who are digital trainers or become what I think of as digital care workers. That it's not just a skill that involves technological prowess, but communicational skills. Um, and many of these skills often come from outside the tech realm. They may become a part of an education in the social sciences and humanities that raises awareness of the power of our current social discourses that too often stigmatize older adults as inept, incompetent, or irrelevant. And this needs to be countered, of course. And that becoming a warm expert, should you choose to become one, is not only about patience and caring, but it also requires an expertise and a knowledge that understands the diversity, the heterogeneity of older adults as individuals, but also in relationship to different kind of backgrounds that they bring with them. And that is to become aware of the intersectional dynamics of power at play in any of these situations. That I wonder and worry as I watch what's happening and part of programs like MedTech or programs that are really seeing technology as a solution about a kind of what I guess a recurring digital division of gendered labor, where digital care work may, I fear, become undervalued and not understood as a skill. And again, because it's sometimes framed as being only within the family, that there's the idea that this is work that does not need to be remunerated and promotes the assumptions that patience and empathy are innate, cannot be developed, cannot be learned, and cannot be taught. I think I also worry that the idea of thinking of innateness of the doing of the care work within only the intimate family or kinship structure may reify or promote a notion that natural caregiving takes place only in a family, and not everybody has a family. That can also reify classist and sexist devaluations of the skills that are crucial for success in traditionally gendered sectors like care work, education, hospitality, or in the service industry, and indeed in digital literacy training. And we're seeing this, I'm seeing this in the libraries that I work with and with some of the non-for-profit organizations where this kind of work is not fully understood for, I think, what it has to offer and for how important it actually is. So in conclusion, I just want to go back to where I started from to talk about the politics of digital care work and to remind you that care work, as Toronto says, is a species activity that we all engage with that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world. And we can say now our digital world, so that we might live as well as possible and as ethically as possible within it. That this world includes as well our bodies, ourselves, our environments, but also now these technologies that inhabit our homes and our life worlds, all of which interweave in a complex and hopefully life-sustaining web rather than a life-ending web. Toronto also says that the world of care and the world of politics are never far apart, that care is never just about compassion and kindness, nor is politics only about one-upmanship. That what I want to add to that is that care is also about compassion and kindness, but also thinking about the systemic and structural barriers that may prevent us from acting in these kinds of ways. So that's the end of my talk. And I want to leave not with you asking me questions you can about anything I do or challenging me about anything I said if you're still awake. But I guess I want to ask you to take a few minutes to pause, to breathe, to take care of yourself. Maybe close your eyes from the screen. Just take a moment to stop and reflect, to think about a technology that you have in your life or a way that a technology may have helped you connect with someone or impeded you at times. But I want to begin with asking you a series of questions. What do you consider to be a technology? And what are the significant technologies in your life? Have you, that should be you, not you performed digital care work? What was it? What did you learn from it? In what context? If you're a professional or you're here as a student or in some other capacity, how are digital media changing your profession and field? And finally, I want to ask, given what I've said today and what I think it may be missing in some of the fields of social and cultural gerontology or perhaps occupational therapy, what future positions will need to be created to accommodate this kind of profusion and this kind of, maybe it's an incursion, proliferation, ubiquitous presence of technology in our life world now? What are the kinds of occupations that you think might be important if we're going to pursue and a world together where we're not just throwing an iPad at an older person and telling them, here you go, but actually teaching them how digital tools and devices might actually enable their aging in a way that is promoting their well-being. So I thank you.